When Su Xiaolu woke up, she felt hungry and uncomfortable. She wanted to cry, but she held back when she felt her weak mother beside her. Madame Zhao survived, but she was still very weak. Therefore, Su Xiaolu imitated her previous actions and put her little hand to Madame Zhao's mouth to feed her the spiritual spring water. Madame Zhao was weak and tired. She was in a deep sleep and subconsciously swallowed the water. When Madame Li pushed the door open, Su Xiaolu retracted her hand. At first, she thought that her father was back. But the person did not say anything and her aura was not friendly. When the person walked in, Su Xiaolu vaguely saw that it was a woman. She hadn't seen her before and didn't know who she was. But when she thought about it, there was only one person who could come here. It was none other than her mother's sister-in-law. Madame Li sat down by the bed. She did not notice that Su Xiaolu had woken up. She gently pushed Madame Zhao and shouted, "Third sister-in-law, third sister-in-law, wake up, I have good news to tell you." Madame Li could not help but smile smugly. Madame Zhao was woken up by Madame Li. Madame Zhao said in a daze, "Sister-in-law." Madame Li said with a smile, "Third sister-in-law, I have to congratulate you. You finally made it. I'm so envious of you. In the future, you don't have to live in fear of our mother-in-law anymore. Although the old house is a little dilapidated, it's definitely enough for your family of 6 to live in. Although Chong and Hua are not clear-headed, as long as you teach them well, they will definitely be good at work. The land is also close to the back of the house. If your family diligently takes care of it, it will be fertile in a few years. Just thinking about it makes me envious. Also, mother gave your family 2 chickens, a male and a female. If they lay eggs and reproduce, there will be a large group of them next year. She also gave you 10 caddies of meat, and 30 caddies of green vegetables. You will have meat and vegetables to eat during your confinement period. It's said that you have to rely on the mountain to eat. When third brother is free, he can even set up a trap or something nearby so that you can hunt and eat wild animals often. Third sister-in-law, you're really lucky. I'm so envious of you. Don't be too excited. Rest well. After Dalong, second brother, and third brother have moved everything. Third brother will come and bring you and your daughter over." After Madame Li finished speaking, she saw tears in Madame Zhao's eyes. She pretended not to see them and left with a smile. Madame Zhao quickly understood from Madame Li's words that her family had been separated. Moreover, they had been given so little. Madame Zhao knew very well what this meant. She had just calmed down, but she now felt as if she had swallowed a bitter pill. How was their family going to survive this winter? While Madame Zhao was in pain, she was pulled back to reality by a weak cry. She turned around and saw that Su Xiaolu was pouting. She cried softly. When Madame Zhao looked at her, Su Xiaolu smiled. "Simei, are you comforting mother?" The baby's smile seemed to have the power to heal. It warmed Madame Zhao's heart and cheered her up. She was a mother, and she had children. No matter how difficult it was, she had to keep going. "Aya, yes, I am comforting you," Su Xiaolu thought. Su Xiaolu looked at Madame Zhao and laughed again. From the woman's words, she knew that they had been separated from the family and was in a very difficult situation. She also had 2 older brothers who were silly and they did not have much. Su Xiaolu understood what this meant. Life in the olden days was difficult. It was hard to say if their family could survive this winter, let alone the following years. If the land was bad, it meant that there would never be enough food to eat. If there was not enough to eat, there would be no extra food to exchange for money. Without money, they could not afford to hire a doctor when they got sick. It was a vicious circle. Being separated like this was undoubtedly a dead end for their family, but the good times would come slowly. She wasn't a real baby. For her own sake and for her family's, she had to work hard to help them live a better life. Spiritual spring water could nourish the body. If the family drank it, they would be healthy and have the strength to farm. If there wasn't much land, then they would have to expand it. Their lives would eventually be better. However, Madame Zhao did not think about this, so Su Xiaolu tried her best to comfort her. It was not easy for Madame Zhao to survive. It would not be good if she was angered and bled again. Thanks to Su Xiaolu's efforts, Madame Zhao's frown disappeared. Clang! A noise came from outside. Madame Zhao couldn't help but ask, "San Lang, are you back?" A low voice came from outside. "Mom, can Hua and I come in?" Su Chong asked from outside the door, fidgeting his fingers awkwardly. Ever since he heard from Shun that his mother had given birth to a baby girl, he had been thinking about it. The baby who moved around in his mother's womb had been born. He did not know what she looked like, so he had brought his little brother, Hua, along. He tried to peek inside, but it was too dark to see anything. He even accidentally pushed over a piece of wood by the door, making a noise. "Mother, I want to see my sister too." Su Hua also spoke quietly. When Madame Zhao heard the voices of her 2 silly sons, she sighed and said, "Come in." Su Chong and Su Hua were both mentally ill. Su Chong was better, and Su Hua was worse. She often said, "Chong, you have to work hard. You have to listen to your father and don't wander around. Hua, you have to listen to your father and your brother. You can eat well if you work well." Under her subtle influence, other than the fact that his two sons had not grown up mentally, they were considered good. They could listen to their parents well and help with the work. Although they did not do it very well, they were obedient and did not hit anyone. Even if they were hit, they would not retaliate. Because of this, they were injured by others several times. Thinking of her two silly sons, Madame Zhao did not feel good. After obtaining Madame Zhao's approval, Su Chong and Su Hua pushed open the door and entered. Soon, they arrived beside Madame Zhao and lay beside her to look at their sister. Su Xiaolu, who was awake, also watched her two silly brothers to recognize them. "Our little sister is so cute. Her eyes are like grapes. Grapes taste sour. What about her eyes?" Su Chong asked Madame Zhao. Madame Zhao said patiently, "Simei's eyes can't be eaten. Her eyes are used to look at you. You have to protect them well. If you eat them, she won't be able to see you." Su Chong seemed to understand and agreed with a smile. "No, I won't eat them. Sister, look at me." Su Hua didn't say anything, but he seemed to be considering what Su Chong had said. Finally, he thought about it, shook his head, and smiled at Su Xiaolu. "No, I won't eat them." Su Xiaolu screamed. Hearing her two silly brothers' questions made her a little nervous, but after listening to Madame Zhao's guidance, she was relieved. The sad part was that these two brothers were really out of their minds. Ordinary people would not be asking such a question. She did not know if drinking spiritual spring water every day would help them to improve. She did not know if their stupidity could be cured. She would only know when she grew up and took their pulses. Su Xiaolu smiled at her two silly brothers. Su Chong and Su Hua were very happy. Sister smiled. "I like it." Su Chong could not help but laugh, and so did Su Hua. Madame Zhao's heart warmed. At this moment, she forgot her sadness and couldn't help but smile. The panic about the unknown difficulty was gone at this moment. Now, there was only warmth and peace. It was a pity that such peace did not last long before it was broken. Voices came in from outside. Madame Li deliberately raised her voice and said, "You finished, third brother. You're here to pick up my sister-in-law and the kids, right? I just saw Chong and Hua coming home." Su Sanlang didn't start a conversation with Li, but glanced at her. Madame Li immediately shut her mouth. She had heard that Su Sanlang had done something indecent in the past and could not be provoked. After being chased out, he might be holding back his anger now. If he were to vent it on her, how unlucky would she be? Madame Li regretted her words earlier. At this moment, Madame Wang came out of the main room and said with a cold expression, "What are you waiting for? Hurry up and bring your family over to clean up while it's still early. I've already given you all what you need. We won't be cooking for your family tonight." When Madame Li heard this, she secretly rejoiced. With this, Madame Wang had directed all of Su Sanlang's hatred to herself. Compared to her sarcastic tone just now, Madame Wang's words were more heart-wrenching. Su Sanlang looked at Madame Wang. His mother's gaze was very cold, and it made his heart ache. After just one look, he lowered his eyes and clenched his fists. Before turning around and walking towards the back room, Old Master Su came out and said to Su Dalong and Su Erlang, "Call Shun, Qing, and the others. It's still early. Let's go to the fields again." Su Dalong had 3 sons. Due to the incident today, everyone had returned home. Now, they had already gone out to play. Su Erlang had 2 sons and a daughter. His daughter had been taken by his wife, Madame Zhou, to visit her maiden home. So his 2 sons naturally went out to play too. Since their father had spoken, the 2 of them naturally did not dare to disobey. After all, their son still needed his father to pay for their studies. Hence, they each picked up a few baskets. They went out with Old Master Su and called their children to the fields. As for Su Sanlang's family, they had already been separated. The crops that the family had not finished collecting had nothing to do with his family. The conversation in the outer room entered Su Sanlang's ears. He stopped outside the door for a long time and waited for Old Master Su and the others to leave before reaching out to open the door and enter. He thought that Madame Zhao was still asleep and was thinking about how to explain the situation to her. But when he got used to the dim light, he saw that his 2 sons were already packing up. When he met Madame Zhao's gentle eyes, Su Sanlang choked. "My dear wife." Madame Zhao's eyes were gentle and a little tearful. She said gently, "Sanlang, don't say anything. As long as our family is together, it's better than anything." "Yes," Su Sanlang answered, his voice nasal. He would feed the family, he vowed. At worst, he would go hunting in the mountains. The next step was to pack up the family's belongings. Madame Zhao wanted to help pack up, But Su Sanlang stopped her. He said, "Don't move. Let me handle these small matters. I'll bring Chong and Hua there to prepare the beds first. When Sanmei comes back later, tell her to stay by your side. I'll come and pick you up soon." Anything that could be used in this house belonged to his family, so he had to take them with him. Today, Madame Zhao had stained a blanket with blood. Although it was dirty, they still had to take it. It could still be used after washing. All the needlework in the house and the small wooden stools were to be brought along as well. Even the window paper that Madame Zhao had saved was packed away. Su Sanlang and his two sons moved some bedding over, leaving Madame Zhao and Su Xiaolu in the house. Not long after, Su Sanmei returned with the medicine bag. When she returned home, she saw that the house was empty and felt a little uneasy. Madame Zhao called her gently. "Sanmei, come here, come to mother." Su Sanmei went over obediently and quietly. She didn't understand why the house had changed so much after she'd only been out for a while. Madame Zhao gently stroked Su Sanmei's dry hair and said gently, "Sanmei, we're moving to a new house. Your father, eldest brother, and second brother have already gone over to prepare the beds. They'll come and pick us up in a while." Su Sanmei understood. She seemed to want to say something but didn't. She looked at Su Xiaolu, who was awake, and saw her smile. She smiled back. "Mother, Mei is so beautiful." Seeing that Su Xiaolu was smiling again, Madame Zhao couldn't help but touch Su Xiaolu's little face. She said gently, "Yes, and she's very obedient. She hasn't drank milk for so long but she didn't cry." "Sanmei, you must be tired today. Come and sleep for a while. When your father and brothers come back later, mother will wake you up," Madame Zhao said gently to Su Sanmei. Su Sanmei was only 6 years old, but she still had to work. It was tough for her to carry a huge basket on her back. Today, their family had been chased out, but it was also the rarest day of leisure. Su Sanmei climbed into bed and quickly fell asleep beside Su Xiaolu. Su Xiaolu yawned and continued to sleep. After moving to a new house, Madame Zhao should be able to eat. She would also be able to eat soon. Madame Zhao looked at her two obedient daughters and her heart softened. After less than 10 minutes, Su Sanlang returned with Su Chong and Su Hua. The only things left in the house were the mattress under Madame Zhao and the blanket covering her. There were also 3 small stools. Su Sanlang wrapped Madame Zhao in a blanket and carried her on his back. Su Xiaolu was carried by Su Sanmei while Su Chong and Su Hua took the remaining stools. When the family came out of the room, Madame Li and Madame Wang stood in the courtyard and watched. Seeing that Su Sanlang treasured Madame Zhao so much, Madame Wang mocked coldly. "What's so good about her? If it were me, I would have long pressed her into a bucket and drowned her." Su Sanmei was very afraid of Madame Wang. Upon hearing Madame Wang's harsh words, she quietly hugged Su Xiaolu tighter. Su Chong and Su Hua did not understand the vicious meaning of these words. In the past, when they were scolded, they would just lower their heads and admit their mistakes. This time, it was different. They couldn't help but look at their father. Su Sanlang, were they still going to admit their mistake? Su Sanlang did not stop walking or look at Madame Wang. He gently called out to Su Chong and Su Hua, "Chong, Hua, walk faster." Su Chong and Su Hua obeyed and immediately stopped hesitating. Madame Wang felt uncomfortable. She really wanted to see Su Sanlang kneel down and beg her to change her mind. But Su Sanlang did not. Madame Wang did not stand on ceremony either. She went straight to the kitchen to scoop a ladle of water and splashed it closely behind Su Sanlang's family. Accompanying the splashing sound was Madame Wang's extremely sarcastic words. "The jinx will die far away from my family. Bodhisattva, please bless our family with fortune and wealth in the future." Su Hua scratched his head and asked in confusion, "Dad, what's a jinx?" Su Sanlang's face was filled with pain. Tears rolled down his cheeks and fell to the ground. He didn't answer his son's question because his heart ached and he couldn't speak. He was even more afraid to look at his son, afraid that they would be scared and uneasy if they saw him crying, because he was their mountain that supported them and protected them. Su Sanlang quickened his pace. Su Chong and Su Hua quickly forgot to wait for an answer and jogged after him. Su Sanmei carried Su Xiaolu and walked very quickly too. Su Xiaolu could not sleep. She was afraid that her frail sister would fall and send her flying. Fortunately, although her sister was skinny, her steps were steady. Along the way, many people from the same village came out to take a look, but no one said anything. Su Sanlang did not have the time to talk to anyone. The Su family's old house was at the end of the village, and it was quite a distance away from the exit. The house was behind the village. Behind the house were a few acres of thin land that stretched up to the mountain forest. They were covered in weeds. In the future, this would be the source of food for their family. The roof of the old house was a little broken. The earthen walls were also broken in many places. There was also moss on the walls, and the wooden door was so rotten that a 3 or 5-year-old child could have crawled right through it. The only good thing was that the light was bright. Around the house, the weeds were thigh-high. The old well was also overgrown with water plants and the water stank. The old house, abandoned for decades, had once again welcomed a new owner. There was melancholy in Madame Zhao's eyes. Su Sanlang smiled at her and said, "Have a good rest first. You haven't eaten anything today. Let's clean up the house tomorrow. I'll go start the fire to wash the rice and start cooking first. Let's have a full meal today," Madame Zhao said worriedly. "Sanlang, I'm not hungry. We don't have much food, and winter is coming. We have to eat sparingly." The food was distributed well, so Madame Zhao did not want to eat too much. However, Su Sanlang smoothed Madame Zhao's hair and said, "Don't worry, there are many things in the mountains. Our family will definitely be able to live a good life. We have to eat our first meal and start off well. In the future, we will eat our fill every meal." Madame Zhao could not refute him. She could only nod with red eyes. Okay, whether they could survive through this winter or not, they were together as a family, alive and dead. Madame Zhao was still very weak and could not get out of bed, but she was worried about her family. She heard Su Sanlang calling for Su Sanmei to cook together. She heard Su Sanlang calling Chong and Hua to remove the weeds in the courtyard, and let the two sons compete in pulling out the weeds. Whoever won would be able to eat an extra piece of meat tonight. The brothers were competitive and worked hard. She also heard a chicken crowing outside the house. Soon the smell of fire rose. Madame Zhao looked down at the sleeping Su Xiaolu gently and murmured, "Simei, we can definitely get better, right?" The sun was setting in the west, and the red dusk was stunning. Madame Zhao looked at the light that shone in and thought that it was extremely beautiful. In that home, the family had lived in the back room, backlit and dim, and they had never seen the glow of dusk. How beautiful. After dark, Su Sanlang cooked bacon soup and fragrant white rice. He scooped a large bowl of rice for Madame Zhao to eat, supporting Madame Zhao to sit up and eat. Su Sanlang said guiltily, "There are 2 chickens, 1 male and 1 female. The hen hasn't laid any eggs yet. Otherwise, you would be able to eat eggs. Next year, we'll have a nest of chickens. When the time comes, I'll kill 2 chickens for you to eat." Madame Zhao had just given birth and needed nutrition, but he could not give her anything. Madame Zhao smiled and said, "I don't like to eat chicken. We should keep it and sell it for money to make clothes for all of you. You gave me so much rice. Have you eaten? Do the children have enough to eat?" Although the days were hard, with Su Sanlang treating her well, her heart was always sweet. The couple smiled at each other as they spoke. Madame Zhao couldn't eat anymore. "Go get a bowl. My appetite is small. So how can I eat so much? I'll share half of it." Su Sanlang's eyes were red. He choked slightly and said, "Eat. I cooked 4 bowls of rice. There's more than enough for all of us to eat. My little girl hasn't had any milk yet. She must be starving too. And you have to feed 2 people alone." Su Xiaolu was really obedient. If Dr. Wu had not said that she was fine, Su Sanlang would have thought that the child was not healthy. This child seemed to know what the situation was at home. She woke up a few times and did not cry. She could continue to sleep after changing diapers and drinking some water. Madame Zhao did not continue to decline and started eating, but she also pushed Su Sanlang out to eat. He smiled and nodded and went out. Before he left, he said, "Just eat. If you don't have enough, call me. There's still plenty in the pot." Madame Zhao nodded with tears in her eyes. She ate carefully, not daring to drop a grain of rice. Everyone in the family had eaten their fill. Not long after Madame Zhao finished her meal, she started feeding Su Xiaolu. Su Xiaolu was very cooperative. After starving for most of the day, she was finally full. After the meal, Madame Zhao felt better. Before she went to bed, Su Sanlang brewed medicine for her to drink. Madame Zhao naturally knew that this medicine was not easy to come by, so she drank it all. In the house with 2 rooms and 2 beds, the exhausted family fell asleep. Late at night, Su Xiaolu placed her hand on Madame Zhao's lips and continued to feed her spiritual spring water. Madame Zhao woke up in a daze and was shocked. She quickly pushed Su Xiaolu away and muttered, "I'm so full tonight. Why am I eating your little hand again?" With that, Madame Zhao got up and changed Su Xiaolu's diaper. Then, she wrapped her small hands in it and tied her up gently with a cloth rope. Su Xiaolu was speechless. She had miscalculated. Madame Zhao looked at the obedient Su Xiaolu and couldn't help but kiss her cheek. Simei is so obedient. After wrapping up her daughter, Madame Zhao fed Su Xiaolu again before she went back to sleep. Somehow, she felt comfortable. Her body was not heavy at all. The stuffed Su Xiaolu burped and fell asleep too. She was still a baby. so naturally she slept most of the time. When dawn came, Su Sanlang rose early to light the fire and cook. There was still a winter to survive through, so today's meal would not be as good as yesterday's. In the rice, there were ground golden jade sticks, and the soup had little oil in it. Su Xiaolu watched as Madame Zhao ate. She recognized rice. It had a long history. The thing in the rice should be corn. The earliest record of corn in history was in the 34th year of the Jiajing dynasty of the Ming dynasty, Gong County records. It was called jade wheat. These were all ancient people, but she did not know which dynasty it was. In ancient times, commoners were not allowed to discuss the royal family at will, so ordinary families would not say such things. It seemed she would have to wait at least a few years to find out. However, rice and corn could be cultivated in this place. The staple food should be these. They should be in the south. In modern places like the Yunggui River and Chongqing, the staple food was rice and corn. In ancient times, these places were called Jingguan, Yizhou, and Furong City. She would know all this when she grew up. When she saw Madame Zhao eating so happily, Su Xiaolu also felt hungry. Madame Zhao's energy was much better than yesterday. Although she was still very thin, her complexion was better. Su Sanlang came in to collect the bowls. He was also happy to see this. He smiled and said, "When the medicine is ready, San Mei will bring it to you to drink. I'll bring Chong and Hua to prepare a few traps at the foot of the mountain and chop some wood. In a few days, I'll go to town to ask if those big families want to buy firewood. I'll cut wood to sell." Su Sanlang was very detailed. He hoped that Madame Zhao would not worry about their livelihood. He was free, young and strong. He would think of a way to feed his family. How could Madame Zhao not understand? She smiled and nodded. "Sanlang, bring some rice balls with you. Be careful." Su Xiaolu looked at Su Sanlang and smiled at him. "Ah," she greeted Su Sanlang with this. Su Sanlang smiled and looked at Su Xiaolu gently. "Simei, you're so obedient. I'll come back to see you when I'm done." There was no time to waste. After instructing Su Sanmei, Su Sanlang brought Su Chong and Su Hua into the mountains. As they were near the back of the mountain, it was convenient, though remote. At this moment, the villagers were all busy with the autumn harvest. They struggled to harvest their own crops, so how could they have the time to enter the mountains? Only Su Sanlang, who was chased out by his parents and did not have to do farm work, had the time to enter the mountains. After Su Sanlang left, Su Sanmei obediently heated up the medicine for Madame Zhao. She then helped Madame Zhao change Su Xiaolu's diaper. Su Xiaolu could only cry after peeing 3 times or pooping. Peeing 3 times was the most she could tolerate. Babies didn't pee much, and diapers that were too wet would be uncomfortable. Wearing them might give her a rash. 3 times was about right. If they changed it in time, Madame Zhao could rest in peace and did not have to worry about rashes. After dinner, Su Xiaolu went to bed. Eating more and sleeping more was her current goal of survival. Su Sanmei did not stay idle either. She dug earthworms in the courtyard and fed them to the 2 chickens at home. At noon, she heated up Madame Zhao's lunch. With the nourishment of the spiritual spring water, Madame Zhao could get out of bed today. She wanted to clean up the house, but as walk out, Su Xiaolu cried. Madame Zhao's body was so weak. So how could she work at this time? If she was tired, she would die early. Su Xiaolu cried her heart out. Madame Zhao had no choice but to return to her bed to comfort her. After repeating this a few times, Madame Zhao saw the tears on Su Xiaolu's face and her heart softened. She wiped her tears and sighed. "Simei, are you afraid that I won't be by your side? Don't be afraid. I'm here." Su Xiaolu pouted. Wah, she was in poor health. How could she do work? Resting for a month would be better. She didn't need to think to know that her mean grandma wouldn't let Madame Zhao go through confinement the previous few times. Therefore, Madame Zhao's body was very weak. Even if she had been nourished by the spiritual spring water for the past 2 days, it was only for a short period of time. She did not even need to take Madame Zhao's pulse to know that her health was extremely poor. Therefore, as long as Madame Zhao wanted to work, she would cry. Madame Zhao sighed and coaxed Su Xiaolu to sleep. She called Su Sanmei in and instructed her. "Sanmei, come and sleep with Simei. I'll clean up the house." She couldn't do the heavy work. At least she could try to clean up that old well. That way, Su Sanlang would have clean water to drink when he came back from a tiring day. He wouldn't have to walk the long way to fetch more. Su Sanmei obediently lay down in Madame Zhao's place. Madame Zhao stood up and prepared to leave. Su Xiaolu pouted. "Awa," Su Sanmei hurriedly coaxed. "Simei, don't cry. I'm here. Simei, be good." Su Xiaolu thought. Don't listen. Anyway, she had to cry. The loud and heart-wrenching cry made Madame Zhao's heart clench. She had no choice but to give up on the idea of going out to clean up and quickly return to the bed. Boo-hoo, it's not easy being a baby, Su Xiaolu thought. Madame Zhao watched as Su Xiaolu stopped crying inside. After a few times, she gradually understood that her daughter had recognized her. When Madame Zhao came back to accompany Su Xiaolu, Su Sanmei went out to catch worms again. In the afternoon, Su Sanlang returned with Su Chong and Su Hua, carrying several pounds of wild chestnuts. Su Chong and Su Hua immediately called for Su Sanmei. Sanmei, come quickly, I have something for you. Su Chong took out 2 chestnuts and gave them to Su Sanmei. Worried that Su Sanmei wouldn't be able to bite through them, he cracked them open using his teeth and handed them over. Su Sanmei did not mind at all. She took it and wiped it before peeling it open. The 3 of them squatted in the courtyard and ate happily. Su Sanlang entered the house and said to Madame Zhao with a smile, "Do you think I'm lucky? When Chong and I entered the mountain, we discovered this wild chestnut tree. In previous years, we definitely wouldn't have been able to get anything from it. It just so happens that it's autumn now and everyone else is busy. Our family can take everything on this tree for ourselves. I didn't bring my basket with me today. I roughly brought back 4 or 5 caddies. I think there's still more than 10 caddies left on the tree." Su Sanlang was delighted. He was in luck. After entering the mountain to set a few traps, he encountered this wild chestnut tree. It happened to be ripe. In the past, when the autumn harvest was over and before it snowed, the villagers would enter the mountain to chop wood. Anyone who came across this wild chestnut tree would harvest the chestnuts from it. This year, everyone was at the autumn harvest. He had come across it first, so it belonged to his family. Madame Zhao was also happy, but she still reminded gently, "Sanlang, you must be careful. Forget it if the tree is too tall." Su Sanlang smiled and nodded. "I know, I'll go tomorrow and bring them all back. I'll keep some for us to eat and sell some." When they separated from the family, his parents did not give them a single cent. They had to prepare their winter clothes for this winter themselves. Wild chestnuts were considered rare. He would pick them and keep the bad ones for himself and sell the good ones. Madame Zhao nodded. Okay, this good news made the family very happy. Madame Zhao was in a good mood. She felt that God was looking after her family. Su Sanlang looked at the wide-eyed Su Xiaolu and asked, "Is Simei behaving well today?" Su Xiaolu immediately pouted. She felt very aggrieved when she saw Su Sanlang. Wah! After a few aggrieved grunts, she glanced at Madame Zhao again, then back at Su Sanlang. She was making a silent complaint. As a rough man, Su Sanlang suddenly understood. Then, he looked at Madame Zhao in confusion. "Why do I feel that Simei is complaining to me?" Madame Zhao was a little surprised. She was also very surprised, not to mention Su Sanlang. Even she felt the same way. She's only just been born, yet she knew how to complain and feel aggrieved. "Did you starve Simei without milk?" Su Sanlang looked at Madame Zhao in embarrassment. Madame Zhao was weak and did not eat anything good, so it was normal for her to not have milk. A newborn child would only cry when she was hungry or when she pooped. If she couldn't speak and the adults didn't take good care of her, wouldn't she be aggrieved? Madame Zhao said uncertainly. "I think so. I'll feed her and see if she's anxious." With that, Madame Zhao prepared to feed Su Xiaolu. Su Sanlang glanced away. Su Xiaolu shook her head. She wasn't hungry. Su Xiaolu did not eat. Madame Zhao tidied her clothes gloomily and said, "She's not hungry." As she spoke, she suddenly seemed to remember something. A guess formed in her mind. She exclaimed, "It can't be." When Su Sanlang saw her like this, he quickly asked, "What do you mean? What did you do today?" Without waiting for Madame Zhao to reply, Su Sanlang said anxiously, "Did you start working today? You just gave birth to Simei and your body is still weak. It wasn't easy for you to survive. How can you work?" Seeing that Su Sanlang was anxious, Madame Zhao quickly explained, "Sanlang, I didn't. It's like this. Listen to me. I feel much better today. I have strength and am not tired. So I wanted to get up and tidy up the house. But strangely, as soon as I wanted to go out, Simei cried." Thinking about it now, Madame Zhao felt that it was unbelievable. Perhaps this young daughter did not recognize her, but did not want her to work. Madame Zhao looked at Su Xiaolu's bright eyes and softened. She continued gently, "I even asked Sanmei to come in and take care of Simei, but even so, Simei will still cry if I go out." Su Sanlang heaved a sigh of relief upon hearing that. He leaned over and picked up Su Xiaolu. He smiled and said, "Our Simei is smart. She knows how to take care of her mother. She's a filial child." Su Xiaolu stopped feeling aggrieved and looked at Su Sanlang seriously. Her father was so dark. However, his broad arms and his eyes were warm and gentle. To have such a father was undoubtedly very blissful. Even if this was the ancient times, even if it was difficult, she wanted this family to have a good life. No matter what era it was, being a doctor definitely promised a good life. Besides, she had more than 20 years of Chinese medicine skills and had the space to assist her. There would definitely be no problem. With that in mind, Su Xiaolu smiled at Su Sanlang. Su Sanlang's heart was filled with warmth. He felt all his fatigue disappear with his daughter's smile. He couldn't help but smile as well. Si Mei is so obedient, he said gently. You know how to take care of mother. After praising his daughter, Su Sanlang turned to Madame Zhao and said seriously, you have to rest well this month. You didn't recover well the previous few times, so take good care of yourself this time. No one will say anything about you now. Just leave the family to me. Dr. Wu said that your body is weak, so you have to recuperate well. If your body breaks down, what will happen to our children? Su Sanlang actually wanted to say that he wanted to grow old with Madame Zhao, but he couldn't bring himself to say such corny words, so he could only bring up Dr. Wu and the children. Dr. Wu's words were convincing, and Madame Zhao cared about their children the most. Therefore, for the sake of the children, she would take good care of her body. Madame Zhao felt a lump in her throat and nodded repeatedly. Okay, I'll listen to you. It'll be hard for you this month. Su Sanlang did not care. It's not hard at all. You rest. I'll go out and cut the weeds and mend the roof while the weather's good. After talking so much with Madame Zhao and knowing that she and their youngest daughter were fine, Su Xiaolong went out to cut the weed with ease. As he came out, he said to Su Chong, Su Hua, and Su Sanmei in the courtyard, Chong, Hua, Sanmei, come here. The three siblings obediently walked over and looked up at Su Sanlang. They called out to him in unison, Daddy. There was something wrong with Su Chong and Su Hua's heads. Their eyes were always blank, as if they were 3 or 4-year-old children who would never grow up. However, Chong was already 11 years old, and Hua was turning 10 this December. On the other hand, Su Sanmei was 6 years old, yet she was quiet and her eyes were bright. Su Sanlang patted their heads one by one and said gently, Chong, Hua, Daddy has a mission for you. Pull the weed in our well clean and carry that smelly mud outside. When it's done, Daddy will roast chestnuts for you tonight. Okay, the well was not deep. It had been built with an outlet, but it had not been used for many years, and it was half filled with foul mud. With this well cleaned, it would be easier to use water at home. It wasn't cold now, so the 3 kids at home could do the job. Okay, Su Chong and Su Hua couldn't help licking their lips when they heard that there was food. They didn't understand much, but they knew that there was food if they worked hard. If they ate good food, their stomachs would be very happy. Su Sanmei nodded obediently. Don't worry, father, my brothers and I will work hard. At 6 years old, she already understood a lot. She knew that her brothers were a little different. Everyone else called them fools. She also thought her brothers were stupid and often didn't understand words. But even so, her 2 brothers would pick sweet and sour wild fruit for her to eat. They were good to her. Every time they smiled at her, they only had eyes for her, like spotless snow. No matter how good other people's brothers were, they were never hers. No matter how unintelligent her brothers were, they were still very, very good brothers to her. Su Sanlang was gratified to see his 3 obedient children and left to cut the weed. He had been given only a hoe, a sickle, and a pair of tongs, which had been broken for more than a decade as tools. One of the tongs was half broken, and an ear was broken where he held it. It was neither easy to hold nor to use, but it was better than nothing. Carrying a basket with a broken shoulder rope, he went to cut the weeds. The old house was in disrepair. If he didn't hurry up and renovate the roof, it would be a difficult winter. Thinking about his wife and children, Su Sanlang worked hard and had soon cut a large patch. Many people who were burying their heads in the autumn harvest could not help but shake their heads. Speaking of the Su family, everyone knew that old Master Su was ruthless and Madame Wang was vicious. However, it was fine to talk about other people's matters behind their backs. It was impossible for them to really speak up for Su Sanlang. Su Sanlang was not their son. If they stood up for him, wouldn't they be sending themselves to be cursed at by Madame Wang? 3rd brother. A voice called out to Su Sanlang, who looked up and quickly said, Huzi, the family is so busy, don't waste your time here.